Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The Schizophrenic Society, Identity Politics. The term schizoid refers to an individual, the totality of whose experience is split in two main ways. In the first place, there is a rent in his relation to the world, and in the second, there is a disruption of his relation with himself. There is the story of the patient in a lie detector who was asked if he was Napoleon. He replied no. The lie detector recorded that he was lying. R.D. Laing, The Divided Self. Well, hi everybody, and this is a line that runs through my head talking about hearing voices in your head, but the world's gone mad. And just to accompany this is The Yard of a Madhouse by Hoyer from 1794. And what I wanted to look at today was the topic of schizophrenia, but I approach it from a slightly unusual angle in the sense that, myself included, until I did a bit of research on the topic, I always assumed that schizophrenics suffered from quite profound delusions about the world around them. And while delusion is an aspect of schizophrenia, and that's true, it's actually much more complicated than that. And a lot of schizophrenics have an awareness, a simultaneous awareness. They have delusions and a simultaneous awareness that those delusions are exactly that, delusions. So I'm paraphrasing, but I think one psychiatrist I was reading about describing his own patients said, we have a lot of admirals and generals, but none of my patients have ever tried to take a boat out to sea. Meaning that they at some level believe their delusions, and yet at another level can be quite cynical and arch about those delusions. But why look at schizophrenia at all, and why call it the Schizophrenic Society? Well, the reason for that is this sense the world's gone mad, and there just seems to be quite good evidence from a range of topics. And I'll give a few examples from politics, and I genuinely don't want to come across on one side or the other, but I would hope that whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, most reasonable people would nowadays accept there's a lack of reasonableness. Lots of protests are going on, which is absolutely fine. In a democracy, you'd expect that. But the level of inchoate shouting, the rage, I'll give you examples of an inability to provide any type of argument. And the polarization between left and right that has just reached extremes. So various derangement syndromes on both sides of the spectrum, but family members not speaking to each other if you vote a certain way. And then there's the identity politics, sexuality, gender. In the UK, at least, there are school children identifying as animals and being indulged by, I was going to say parents, but mostly teachers, it seems. It's parents not being told what their children are supposedly identifying as, people being fixated by what pronouns they use, and on and on and on. And it just seems that all times are unusual, all times are strange, but there are certain things that have been true for thousands of years that suddenly, under identity politics, in the UK, for example, we had to wait for a Supreme Court judgment to decide basically what constitutes male and female and who can use which bathrooms. And what for generations was non-controversial, and I'll talk about the role of tradition in all of this, but for generations things have been accepted and conventional, and in recent years there's been this exponential growth in ideologies that turn things upside down. And what I wanted to trace was some of the links this has with schizophrenia. Exists a bit like autism on a spectrum. So that's another thing, the idea that there are pathological schizophrenics who are suffering from a chronic condition. But also, everybody has certain schizoid traits. And in a positive way, it's long been established that people who are highly creative are more prone to mental illness. And, over history, example after example of great artists who've had mental breakdowns. So on this channel, I've looked at Van Gogh. He had a mental breakdown, and you could go on. But even the people who've been relatively highly creative and also sane have an ability often to empathize imaginatively with mentally ill people, or to see the world from a completely uncanny, different perspective. So I'll be giving examples as we go along of De Chirico, Giorgio De Chirico, and some of the atmosphere that you can see in his paintings. And he's written quite evocatively about the psychological experiences he's had when he's painted what he suddenly felt the world was a bit weird, and he painted that in quite a spontaneous way. And that is an ability that certain artists have. So there's this sliding scale, and the notion that, as in the American Diagnostic Statistical Manual, that tries to delineate and quantify symptoms that qualify as a certain disease, it's quite a clumsy, ham-fisted way of going about things. And given that the channel's focus is upon art, literature, visual art, the idea that these art forms could actually help in understanding and illustrate certain conceptions of what is schizophrenia and how it relates to the wider society, I thought might be quite interesting to look at. So, to kick off, I've mentioned the notion of a schizoid spectrum. I will look at various writers. So one is going to be a psychiatrist, one's a clinical psychologist, and another one, Rod Mengham, will be a professor of English literature who looks from the linguistic side. And that is one of the aspects that's relatively interesting. The role that language plays in schizophrenic symptoms and an inability to use language. So there's a whole range of schizoid traits, and a full-blown schizophrenic is obviously suffering at the far end of the spectrum. But everyone, to some extent, can partake of schizoid traits. And then the question I'm asking today is, what happens when a whole society creates an environment through things like social media in which the fragmentation, the split of the mind, and I'll explain where schizophrenia comes from, the actual phrase, but it involves a splitting of a sense of the self, and also a splitting of the self in relation to reality. And if you live in a society full of technology that encourages a sense of alienation and fragmentation, guess what? Your mental illness goes off the charts, and you start to see some of these traits at a much more aggregate level. And then there's a question of causation and correlation, and to what extent have we created a situation in which people are almost encouraged to exhibit some of these schizoid traits. And the poor reality test. So this is why the idea that the common misconception that in schizophrenia people have a completely deluded sense of reality. And the clinical psychologist I'll be referring to, Louis Sass, S-A-S-S, he has written a couple of books that look in depth to the extent to which this just largely isn't true. So he gives various examples from case studies about people who have suffered psychotic schizophrenic breakdowns, but they still have an awareness. They can be quite scathing about their own condition. They have an awareness. It's this simultaneous, it's this notion of the split. On the one hand, they know they're deluded, but on the other hand, the delusion feels real. That's not the same as being completely deluded. So that's one of the major aspects of schizophrenia, the idea that it's not about necessarily being completely deluded. And this, what's known as the poor reality test, having a poor relationship to reality. Why I'd argue that on an aggregate level, society suffers from some schizoid traits is that certain members of society who are highly functioning So I'd identify politicians and technocrats, people who were high positions in powerful bureaucracies. They actually surround themselves, A, with like-minded people, but B, within a very limited language and outlook on life that actually divorces them from reality in some quite significant ways. And their ability to live in this reality they've constructed for themselves, they can be highly functioning. And maybe in a future date, we'll look at the notion of highly functioning sociopaths and psychopaths. And the belief is that, many people in a much bigger number in society, high functioning businesses and politicians show psychopathic traits. It's how they rose to the top. But likewise, within bureaucracies, this ability to surround yourself with an alternate reality. So, for example, I'll give you one very quick example. I've seen lots, it's happened over the years, I've noticed. When a politician, or especially someone in a bureaucracy, gets asked an ethical, substantive question, watch next time on the news when they reply and refer to process. So they'll say something along the lines of, all the correct processes are being looked into, we will follow this according to the rules, etc. They very rarely, if ever, answer the ethical substantive question in kind. They don't reply, yes, this is horrendous, yes, on a human level, this is horrible. They always distance themselves and absolve themselves from personal moral responsibility by hiding behind a structure. And throughout history, this has had very dark connotations, but I'm suggesting it's still alive and very much well in our society. So another thing that Louis Sass looks at is the concept of hyper-reflexivity. So another misconception of schizophrenia might be that there's almost like a childlike, you revert to a primal, self-absorbed solipsism. You are the center of the universe, and it's all about your own self-satisfaction, and there's a bit of a childish or ecstatic element to it. Well, there may be slight aspects of that, but again, Louis Sass argues more often than not what you find is it's not a lack of thought or infantile thought that leads to schizophrenic traits. It's actually excessive self-reflection, excessive rationalization. And he actually, in one book, looks at Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, and how he actually identified very intelligent abstract philosophers with showing schizophrenic traits, because they create this abstract world in which they live and theorize. And I think it, as I've mentioned, I think that very neatly fits the concept of borderline sociopathic technocrats. So hyperreflexivity is another one. And then there's the distance from, so I'm identifying here habit, ritual, tradition. When I looked at Terence Deacon in the previous couple of videos, and this idea that humankind is a symbolic species, and we've developed language and our brains have co-evolved and developed highly complex ability to facilitate symbols. Part of this is how Deacon suggests that this grew up and was reinforced, the learning of language for the early human beings through various forms of habit and ritual. And then over the generations, various symbolic ways of thinking have been passed down through the mode of tradition. And I'm suggesting that in our society, rituals, traditions have been eviscerated, they've been decaffeinated, they've been emptied out. So one quick example would be the extent to which various young ideologues have actively tried to cancel various aspects of history and not engage with it, and statues being torn down because they have triggering associations with things that happened in the past when people had completely different outlooks on the world. So this inability to empathize with past generations and to adapt. So obviously not all traditions are great. Some traditions need reforming, but there seems to be almost a pathological schizophrenic inability to engage with previous tradition. And that has direct consequences for the concept of the facility with which you deal with symbols. So if one aspect of schizophrenia is struggling to express yourself through language, which is a theme I'll look at, well, part of the way in which, as I mentioned, Terence Deacon, the evolutionary psychologist, and other people have pointed out the crucial importance of ritual, myths, traditions, classical literature, all these things whereby knowledge gets passed down. And an inability or a not being familiar with these type of traditions, and a society that's full of iconic and indexical, which I looked at in the previous video, or two previous videos, this non-symbolic, in-your-face, basic learning or experience of the world through direct correspondence of images all the time. What you see is what you get in social media, representations rather than reflective conceptual thought and the imagination required to engage with things like literature. When these things are emptied out, I've used the word decaffeinated, well, I would suggest that exacerbates the tendency for society to exhibit schizoid traits. And this leads to this correspondence with illiteracy. So the evolutionary psychologist Terence Deacon, his argument is that through the grounding of human experience, the way in which we learn to use symbols are by their nature abstract. They're not indexical, they're not iconic, they don't relate to the here and now. They create their own world. So when you learn a good facility with symbols like language, what it enables you to do is to position yourself in the world, even in an abstract sense, and that helps form a sense of identity. Now, when all the things I've been talking about, when literacy goes out the window, and when you're left with fragmentary social media type environments, that orientation, that sense of self comes under threat. And what you're left in is an abstract world that doesn't have all the traditional forms of symbolic processing that humanity's developed over millennia. And guess what? You find people with a fragmented sense of self. And this is what I'm arguing leads to this almost schizoid trait dominated society we now have. So this idea of how the concepts of the individual self have evolved over time, and I'm going to suggest that we're in I think Gramsci referred to the morbid symptoms of a society where the revolution hasn't fully taken place. I think the self has come under a lot of threat and fragmentation, and we haven't come out the other side yet. So we're in this interregnum Gramsci referred to where morbid symptoms appear. But just to explain this, right up to the Middle Ages, so since time immemorial, since Homer wrote the epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the Bible, the Old Testament, even Sumerian literature, ancient Mesopotamian literature, there's always been this notion that who you are as a person, your identity, is largely defined by your social role, your place within society. Now, the downside of this is these societies are traditional, quite rigid, so your place in society, they're quite circumscribed. You don't have a lot of freedom to go off and do whatever you want. But the plus side is, for millennia, identity confusion was never really an issue. In certain cultures, the very question just wouldn't make sense. Then in the 16th century, you got this movement towards inwardness and role difference, it's called. So role difference refers to the idea that you might feel inside or you might think something that might differ from your public face. And with the rise of, great Elizabethan literature, Shakespeare, etc., arguably, he's hardly ever been bettered, but this voice of interiority, this voice of inwardness that you find in Shakespeare, either contributed to and or reflected this growing notion of inwardness. Now, this gives rise to the concept of sincerity, because what sincerity is the extent to which what you're feeling inside matches how you're presenting yourself to society. So you're sincere if you're not dissembling, if you're not lying, if how you feel is how you're presenting yourself. And then in the 19th century, what grew up was more of a sense of authentic, being true to yourself. So, it's like a shaving advert or an aftershave advert. Be who you really want to be. And this idea of asserting your selfhood. And when you assert your selfhood, or when selfhood becomes more important and your place within society becomes slightly diminished because it's more about you yourself, then questions of authenticity, not sincerity, but authenticity arise. Are you living your authentic life? Are you living the best life you can be? Begins to take on a much bigger role than, are you being sincere? Are you fitting in with what society needs from you? And then I'd argue so up until now, that's all quite well established. Lots of people have written about it. But what I'd argue is in the 21st century, we've entered this weird phase where, and it's paradoxical, the sense of authenticity that grew in the 19th and 20th century, we now have this notion of our way of being authentic is determined by other people, which, if you think about it, is an obvious paradox. How can you be truly authentic and independent if how you conceive of yourself is over-determined by other people on the outside? And I'd suggest this reflects concepts of influencers, or the way in which people's personalities are curated. People are online endlessly showing photographs of their ideal lifestyle. And it's all aspirational, sunsets, and this is what I'm doing. And there's this FOMO, fear of missing out. But there's this external validation or external assessment of how successful you are as a person that's almost been subcontracted out to other people. And at the most existential philosophical level, this is just an obvious contradiction. You can't be genuinely free if you're dependent upon other people for your very sense of identity. And I'd suggest that is contributing, if schizophrenia, as I'll shortly define it, is this concept of being split in various ways. Well, the minute your identity is largely determined by other people, well, that introduces an immediate split. So I mentioned the way artists, so this is Giorgio De Chirico, and I did do a video on artists of the separated self. So if you want more images of De Chirico, I'll just use a few today. But I did do a full video on him, and I'm sure I'll do more in future. But in his manuscripts, he wrote, above all, a great sensitivity is needed. One must picture everything in the world as an enigma. Not only do the great questions one has always asked oneself, but rather to understand the enigma of things generally considered insignificant. To live in the world as if in an immense museum of strangeness. So the words that I'd pick up on the enigma, he's an incredibly enigmatic painter, and why I'm showing you some of his pictures is that he's representing in an artistic form the sense of alienation and the enigmatic nature of reality and living in the world as if in an immense museum of strangeness. This is what I'm describing as almost like a positive form of schizoid traits. Some aspect of this strangeness and alienation is what schizophrenic sufferers or sufferers of schizophrenia exhibit or feel. But to the extent that we can all empathise, artists are better than most of us, or all of us, in the sense they can take it to the next level. So they can express, in a positive artistic form, part of this sense of alienation. And that, I would argue, since the time of Aristotle, the concept of catharsis, the idea that you can get rid of angst, and you can get rid of pent-up feelings through artistic forms. They allow you to disperse some of these negative feelings. I'd be interested in what you think, but when I look at De Chirico paintings, that I find them very odd, but I find them really weirdly peaceful. Almost like De Chirico's done the worrying for me. I just get to see his weird take on the world. But likewise, literature, you can read about people's mental quandaries, their sufferings, the way they've hyper reflected upon everything. But that means that you don't have to suffer the way they did. You can read about, you can empathize with, rather than directly suffering. It's an outlet where, and also just the idea that, you know, other people have had bad thoughts, but you can read about that rather than having to, you know, just wade through your own. It's a displacement, it's a projection, it's all these very subtle things, the enigmatic nature, to use a word that De Chirico uses here, of art. Its very enigmatic, ethereal, non-concrete qualities are arguably what make it such a hugely important psychological resource. So I think this is my favourite of all of De Chirico's work. It's called The Delights of the Poet from 1912. I didn't want to put the text on there because I just wanted to leave it on its own. And it just gives, I think the German word is Stimmung, which means it's some type of uncanny atmosphere. I think this just captures for me what De Chirico does best. And I won't, like I say, go to the video I did on artists of the separated self for a more in-depth discussion, but the way in which there's the anachronism of the classical architecture, but there's a clock, and then in the background you've got the train, and it's the isolated figure, the shadows. He makes use of shadows. The darkness in the sky is slightly ominous. The deepness of the shadows in the porticos, just really odd and atmospheric, but all the better for it. And I just wanted to show you the next one, because the next one it's busier, and I don't like it, for all that matters. But I just wanted to give you a sense of why I think this it's got something about it, partly because it's empty. Whereas this one, Piazza d'Italia from 1913, for me, it's obviously very similar themes, but it's just too busy. There's too much in it. It's the emptiness of the other one that I really liked. And the character in the foreground, there's a very similar figure is used in other paintings. One of which is I showed in the previous video, paints Art of the Separated Self. It's about the Delphic Oracle. There's something about the hunched shoulders. I'm sure there's some chiropractors out there shouting about bad posture, but there just seems to be so much tension. Well, not tension so much as, I don't know, just in a really economically painted figure, there's something hugely enigmatic, as he himself uses the word enigma. And I think maybe why I'm just picking up on the title, Melancholy of a Beautiful Day. I think I'm one of the 10% of people that there's seasonal adjustment syndrome, or disorder, I think it's called, whereby people in winter, because there's a lack of sunlight, people get a bit miserable. I'm the opposite. There's 10% of the population get cheesed off in summertime. And I do find I've been at my most miserable in life when I've been on a summer holiday, like sun-drenched places that I've basically slept through the day so I could go out at night, because I just find the bleakness of the sunlight. I really, and also cursed with Irish skin. So the sun borderline kills you every time you go out in it. But I just don't like the bleakness of, and also beach type holidays. There's this weird pressure. Everyone's running around in swimming trunks, laughing and being happy. And it brings out the miserable person in me, because I just find it really pressurized. Whereas in a UK dark, windblown, rainy winter's day, and everyone looks cheesed off, me, the emotional vampire, becomes quite happy. But anyway, that's enough of my using this video as a confessional booth. But what I'm trying to say in a very clumsy, self-indulgent way is the idea that melancholy and a summer's day isn't normally a theme that a lot of artists pursue. So I appreciate De Chirico for giving us summer miserable people a voice. So I mentioned earlier on Rod Mengham, he's a professor, I think Cambridge, professor of English literature, but he traces the links to be made. He traces the links to be made between language and schizophrenia. And if I continue with this theme, which I hope to, the whole notion of schizophrenia, I will use specific examples, because in people's schizophrenic patient journals and in case files, there's some great material for how schizophrenics have a unique relationship to language. But this is Rod Mengham's analysis. Schizophrenia is generally characterized by a serious degree of incoherence of thought and language, and by an accompanying degree of withdrawal into the self, leading to the overproduction of fantasies. The word schizophrenia itself derives from a Greek verb and noun meaning split, or schizoid, to split, and mind phren, a splitting of the personality which enables the subject to maintain two separate attitudes towards external social reality. So I'll explain what these two separate attitudes are in a second. But this notion that a serious degree of incoherence of thought and language, and as I left the university sector, it was shocking to me the number of students who increasingly couldn't express themselves. And I'm not trying to be snobbish or judgmental, except to say that in a university sector traditionally, it was only the brightest and the best. And the bare minimum you'd expect from students is that they could express themselves really well, both verbally and in written form. And more, partly because of the expansion of numbers, but also just because of declining standards, the number of students who struggled with language, and they always seemed to be the ones who had the most on their file about the need for extra help because of psychological issues. And I just want to draw, I'm not claiming this is necessarily demonstrably provable, but there is, within people like Rod Mengham and others, more in the fields of psychiatry and psychology. I will show in future videos this way in which language is related. The inability to express yourself is a definite symptom of schizophrenia. So the question I'd ask is, to what extent are schizoid traits, so not the profound psychological full-blown schizophrenia, but schizoid traits, feelings of alienation, feelings of splitting, may be exacerbated because people don't have the language with which to express themselves and help themselves orientate their sense of self. Because, as I mentioned earlier, all these traditional literary and artistic methods that have been developed, as Terence Deacon would argue, on an evolutionary basis, they're not as available as they once were because of the declining role of literacy in our society. But just to develop this idea of two separate attitudes towards external social reality. So this notion of the splitting process. The disruption of existing mental associations and their rearrangement into other patterns constitute the most decisive effects of this splitting process. So this goes to, sorry, my eye is talking about being miserable in the summer, hay fever. So my eyes are all watery and swollen. So the disruption of, play a violin please, the disruption of existing mental associations. So this linked to the previous point I made about tradition and habit and the way in which forms of literature could represent existing mental associations and their rearrangement into other patterns. Well, think about social media and what they have done to previously existing mental associations that constitute the most decisive effects of this splitting process. So the rearrangement of associations would follow the promptings of the subject's needs and desires rather than the habitual understanding of objects and their relations given the force and status of rationality by the power of social conventions. A normal conception of the reality which exists outside the subject's own psyche is challenged by a psychical reality formed by unconscious desires or affect. Now, when I read this for the first time, it just struck me that the promptings of the subject's needs and desires. So you must have noticed online there's huge interest, ongoing interest, in the concept of narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. So there are narcissistic traits in society at large that are very much well commented upon. But this idea that the rearrangement of associations would follow the subject's needs and desires. So without going into the murky depths of identity and gender identity and the huge flux that's gone into, but this idea of the habitual understanding of objects and their relations, given the force of rationality by the power of social conventions. So in other words, to give the example, the difference between men and women hasn't been complicated for a few thousand years. But the subject's needs and desires, we live in a society now where your need or desire to express your own subjective preference completely outweighs the habitual understanding of objects and their relations that derive their rationality from the power of social conventions. In other words, for thousands of years, that's the way it was. And now, thousands of years of tradition and convention can be completely overturned by the subject's needs and desires. So the concept of affect, how people feel. And I remember, again, as I was leaving, there's a particular incident I wasn't actually involved in at university, but another member of staff was accused of offending someone. And he basically said, well, but I didn't say anything that was offensive. And the point made back to him by the bureaucrat was, it's not for you to decide, or it's not for any of us to decide. If someone feels offended, then they have been offended. So this is another example, and I'm sure you've got your own examples from your own lives. The feeling of offence is now offence. And I would suggest, in terms of habitual understanding, that is not how society has been organised for hundreds and hundreds of years. I like this idea of integrative imagination, so I'll explain it in a second, but the loss of integrative imagination is an aspect of the modern information-soused, overstimulated condition. The living flow of time, of seamless experience, is lost and cut off from vitality, intuition, emotion, and the body. It becomes static and abstract. So I suggest integrative imagination. Again, I think this is another way that Louis Sass uses this phrase. But it's another way of thinking of imaginative empathy, putting yourself in somebody else's situation. And earlier I mentioned the refusal of some particularly young, ideologically driven people They won't put themselves in the shoes of people from past historical epochs, because they'll say they were racist or whatever, not taking into account the world and culture and the psychology was just profoundly different. It just makes no sense to judge a whole people or society by the values they held dear that we might question. And likewise, in 500 years' time, they will view things we do with horror, probably. But the inability to, because they don't engage with literature or art, they won't read Homer, they won't have a sense of Western culture, how it's evolved over time. The inability, that's what I mean by integrative imagination. The ability to learn from tradition and habit and ritual, which is the opposite of this modern information-soused, overstimulated condition. The living flow of time and of seamless experience is lost. This living flow of time. If you've read the classics, if you've gone from Homer up to the modern classics, this living flow of time. Why I keep banging on about Proust à la recherche de temps perdu, In Search of Lost Time, is that whole ridiculously long novel is about itself, the living flow of time. And towards the end of the novel, how that is overtaken by increasingly modernity and the technology starts to seep in. But this idea that it becomes static and abstract, I thought it, again, Sass actually uses this example from De Chirico as well. The sense of bodily alienation and living in abstract times, that you can see the diagram on the blackboard, this abstraction from the self. I've seen it referred to both as the prophet and the seer. Excuse me. And then I mentioned the phrase Stimmung earlier on, this idea of an atmosphere. For UK viewers, that reminded me of Russ Abbott and his famous song. That's now going to be like an earworm in your head. But Henri Rousseau, I once read an article, I don't think I'm not sure it's been proven, but there was a suggestion that Rousseau had actually seen, I'm pretty sure, unless I imagined it, but I think the argument was that he'd seen one of De Chirico's paintings and it influenced how he then went on to use colour. And there's just something, they look quite inoffensive, Rousseau paintings, but there is something uncanny about them and atmospheric, this notion of the Stimmung. I'll be interested if it's just me or there is just something. And I just find this quite foreboding. It's the tension. It looks like there's going to be a storm, but also the intrusion into this almost rural idyll of the telegraph poles, the phone lines. I think it's a great representation of the intrusiveness. But back to this idea of language and schizophrenia. The schizophrenic's inability to complete a sentence and thus to relate past and present to future is the extreme case of a deviancy that implies, as the boundary for social normalcy, a degree of control over language. Indeed, it sets a condition for normalcy of the human subject altogether as the successful entry into language itself. And this goes back to Terence Deacon and the previous couple of videos, this idea that language is almost defining of humanity in ways that, as I've found out arguing with people online, people really don't seem to understand the crucial aspect of language for our sense of self. And simultaneously, never, as Jonathan Haidt keeps pointing out in The Anxious Generation and books like that, never have youth been so unhappy and so anxious and never have they read so little. Jacques Lacan's famous dictum that the unconscious is structured like a language abbreviates a series of observations on the indispensable role of language in the building of every mind. So that was Jacques Lacan's famous idea that the unconscious is structured like language, which I think I've alluded to in the past, but again might be something to pursue in the future. But if it's true, just grant it for a second, if he's right and the unconscious is structured like a language, well, if people are increasingly lack facility with language, you might see how that makes it more difficult for them to get in touch with their own subconscious or unconscious in various ways. And the way in which, thinking to the way in which Freud started to explore the unconscious through literature, and he got concepts like the Oedipal complex from the classics, narcissism from Ovid, and so on. So this Eugen Bleuler, Dementia Praecox, or the group of schizophrenias, this was, I think, the first major work on schizophrenia. Was he Swiss? I think he was a Swiss. Yeah, he was a Swiss psychiatrist, and he died in 1939. But he said everything which opposes the effect is more deeply suppressed than normally, and whatever falls in line with the effect is abnormally facilitated. The result is that an abnormally charged idea cannot even be opposed in thought anymore. The ambitious schizophrenic dreams only of his desires. Obstacles simply do not exist for him. In this way, complexes are joined together by a common effect rather than any logical connection, not only formed but are also more firmly fixed in the patient. So why I picked this out was it's just struck me that more and more, again, the way in which society is educating this, there aren't allowed to be testing standards. So to take it away from educational attainment, because I just start getting angry and depressed, but things like law enforcement or the army. I've seen videos both about the US and in the UK. It's gone beyond a joke. So in the UK, it used to be, I think, about 5'11" was the minimum, and it was taller than that probably. But at one point, I remember about 5'11" was the absolute minimum before you could join the police. And now, I swear, I've seen 4'11" officers of various genders, and it's just this idea that the idea of reality and the physical nature of obstacles is falling by the wayside because of the greater importance of affect. And this is what Bleuler's describing. Anything that opposes people's wishes or desires, to pick up on the previous quotes, is abnormally facilitated. So it sounds incredibly old-fashioned and borderline sexist just to say, I think people in the army and police should be able to physically perform their duties without crying they're triggered or they're affected or they physically can't do the job because they're too weak. Call me old-fashioned, but it's slightly important if you're in law enforcement that, as well as knowing the laws, you're actually able to do a bit of enforcement. And then there's a whole ideological movement now of defund the police, which, without getting into the politics, just strikes me as wishful thinking. But in this way, complexes are joined together by a common affect rather than any logical connection. And I think, just to give you another visual example, I think this is one of the qualities of De Chirico's work. So in this particular painting, you can see there's just the random. What was that song? Yes, we have no bananas, but there are bananas here. It's, the rather random placement of a big bunch of bananas in the foreground. So what I'm suggesting is I think De Chirico brilliantly portrays associations based upon affect rather than logical associations, which is great if you're doing a painting that can be proved interesting. It's not so good if you're trying to run a society that functions. He definitely had a penchant for the word melancholy in the titles of his paintings. So again, back to Eugen Bleuler, the notion of loss of association. Due to the fact that the associational pathways which join such a complex to other ideas are not used, these associational pathways lose their effectiveness in respect of the more adequate associations. In other words, the effectively charged complex of ideas continues to be isolated and obtains an ever-increasing independence, which is a long-winded way of saying, because this was a technical book, he's writing one of the earliest textbooks about schizophrenia. But what I suggest he's saying is, to pick up on the point I was making previously, I can't say that again. Associational pathways could be thought of as things like literature, things like mythology, traditional stories, ways of associating and grounding our thoughts. But they increasingly become personalized and divorced from previous ways of thinking. So the effectively charged complex of ideas continues to be isolated. So the framework of ideas that the individual creates take on a disproportionate importance and become increasingly disassociated from previous associational pathways. And again, in art, that's not a problem, because what it allows you to do, these are the associational pathways that De Chirico developed. And just to give you some morbid, depressing background to this, I think he lost his sister when he was young. She died tragically. So just in case you were managing to extract any joy from this painting, that little additional piece of information should tip you over the edge. Just the minatory nature of it, the threatening nature of the shadow, what's in the wagon, what's behind the shadows in the portico, the darkness. So back to Mengem, illiteracy and privatization of the mind. So the language of schizophrenic then not only abandons normal sentence structure and habitual ways of making sense with words, it revolves around a new set of private references, which it often makes compelling and urgent through sheer insistence and a perverse systematicalness. That's a word and a half. The private nature of these references is what makes a schizophrenic condition often indistinguishable from a paranoid one. So it's this privatization, all the things I've been talking about habit, tradition, ritual, they're grounded in social bonds. And this is the evolutionary psychologist point from Terence Deacon. Humanity's brain co-evolved with this creation of language and social bonds together. But when you privatize your feelings and your associational pathways, and you have your own, in other words, private language almost, This is one of the reasons why your mind feels split. You're splitting yourself off from the tradition and the conventions that normally in the past endorsed rationality. And just to give you, and I hesitate to do this because I always want to avoid politics. So what I'd ask you to do is, this really is apolitical. The point I want to make now, but the minute you see one of the politicians, you'll think I'm trying to make a particular political point. I'm not. I'm trying to make an anti-bureaucrat, technocrat point of view. So please take it in that spirit. So on the left, you have got, so I'm not sure which way you're going to be seeing this because I'm looking at the camera from a different angle, but you've got obviously J.D. Vance, the American vice president. But I don't know how much of this was covered in the North America or around the rest of the world. But this relates to, in February 2025, there was a security conference for international figures held in Munich in Germany. And this guy was chairing it, and he's called Christoph Hugson, and he was a former German ambassador to the UN. So he's a career diplomat, a career technocrat. And I didn't think it was, I wouldn't, because I'm of his mindset in this one regard. J.D. Vance gave a speech, and because he's the vice president of the US, it's obviously going to be high profile. And he basically suggested that Europe was turning its back on free speech. Now, that's not controversial, I would argue, in the sense that it's demonstrably provable. In the UK, for example, people have been put in prison for tweeting things in a way that is inconceivable that could have happened 20, 30 years ago. And there are Orwellian non-hate crime incidents, is a phrase the police use. You can have a record now for having made or typed hurty words. So just thank the Lord I'm not on X. All right. I'd probably be doing a 30-year sentence. But he makes this point. He's just saying Europe used to have values. J.D. Vance was saying Europe used to have values that enshrined free speech. And he was basically saying, if you're not careful, America and Europe will no longer share certain values they used to share, like free speech and the importance of free speech for the functioning of democracy. And this is why I don't think it's a political point. Whether you're left or right, free speech is crucial for the health of a democracy. It wasn't that long ago where that would be an incredibly uncontroversial statement. So J.D. Vance makes this speech, and then I think it was one of the summing up speeches at the end of the conference. Our friend Christoph Hugson, I used to, think the Germans were quite stiff upper lip like the Brits, emotionally cold, but no. He started crying at the end of the conference because he was so upset that J.D. Vance had been all hurty-worty and said nasty things when all he'd said was free speech should be valued. So he said, we have to fear that our common value base is not that common anymore. And why I'm picking on this is I think that he is an example, our Christoph here, of the schizoid trait of he lives in an abstract world filled with other highly technocratic diplomats, politicians, and people who honestly believe they own the true way and the light, and we need to follow them rather than believing in an open marketplace of ideas and democracies where people are allowed to disagree with each other without being thrown in prison. But it was if you'll bear with me, why I found this quite shocking was it's the emotionality. Whether J.D. Vance was 100% wrong in what he said, I would expect a career diplomat like Christoph here to be able to say respectfully, Vice President Vance, I disagree with you profoundly, and I think you're a jumped up American who shouldn't be coming over here telling us Europeans how to behave. He could have said that. But he didn't. He just had a cry. And that's what I just find, as an emotionally repressed and constipated person, I just find it weird. To the extent that, one of the other fellow people who've seen the technocratic light felt the need to give him a hug. Anyway. And then this, and apologies to any left-wing viewers if there are any left at this point, that this comes from Fox News. But if you ever see, this has gone quite viral. It was on one of the No Kings protest, which again, great, go and protest. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. But they made the mistake, inverted commas, or the highly entertaining decision to ask this lady what she was concerned about, why was she on the march, and she had nothing coherent. In all the previous slides, this issue about affect and feelings and associational pathways, the literacy, she is verbally incapable of expressing why she's on the march. She just starts crying and saying she's afraid. And again, it just strikes me as this is some type of schizoid trait, that more and more people feel very, very upset, but don't seem able to articulate precisely why they're so upset, which ironically then makes me very upset. So we're in this tautological loop of me getting upset at other people getting upset, not knowing why they're upset. At least I know why I'm upset, if that makes me any better. So this notion of victimhood. Paranoid schizophrenics are strikingly prone to delusions of persecution and delusions of grandeur, which makes the kind and degree of their divergence from commonly accepted views of external reality particularly revealing. They show how psychical abnormality and linguistic instability can be correlated to form criteria for levels of socialization. So this is one of the reasons I'm suggesting, to some extent, our society is breaking down. The left and the right cannot have a coherent conversation, especially with that lady I showed you previously. She was just blubbing. And J.D. Vance can't have a rational disagreement with the former German ambassador, the chairman of the Security Conference, because he just wants to have a cry and be hugged by the nearest fellow technocrat. And this idea of persecution and delusions of grandeur, I would suggest that is relevant to a lot of modern day protests. They simultaneously feel all powerful, but also they're victims, and they create situations in which they can become victims. So back to Louis Sass. I would suggest this is it's observable amongst adolescent they-thems. Of all personality types, the schizoid most clearly epitomizes the distinctive elements of the modern condition. It is interesting that schizophrenia does not develop prior to adolescence, for this is the developmental stage of formal operations, when the ability to think about thinking comes into play, along with a new sense of one's separateness as a reflective awareness. The demands for autonomy characteristic of adolescence has been viewed as a stress that can trigger a psychotic break. I just find it quite interesting that it takes to the point you get to adolescence. Young children don't get schizophrenia. And I've, in a previous video, talked about, with reference to identity politics, I made the argument that our society is becoming more adolescent. And I think this is reinforcing what I was saying then. Adolescence may, however, also provide certain prerequisites for the kind of hyper self-consciousness that are characteristic of schizophrenia. So it's not a lack of self-consciousness that leads to schizophrenic behaviour. It's too much. It's thinking you're the center of the universe and obsessing about it. And this, I use the title there, they, thems, this obsession with pronouns. And I've seen various interviews with people, or you can see them on TikTok, the endless videos of people explaining quite pompously what their gender identification is. And I just think back to, maybe I shouldn't use my adolescence as an example, but life was complicated enough just trying to get on and find out who you were. I get exhausted listening to people. It's this, no, I said earlier about personality becoming a curated notion. To actually have to, it takes you half an hour to describe what your gender identification is. That strikes me as not bad proof that you're overthinking it. This hyper self-consciousness. So duality characterizes the schizoid or schizotypical cognitive style, which encompasses both excessive doubting and extreme rigidity and obstinacy, and which can sometimes involve subtle peculiarities of thought or language. What is practical and obvious to others may be missed entirely by them. Commonly, such individuals are obsessed with abstract, metaphysical, or technical concerns, bent on independence and originality. They may pursue these in complete indifference to the opinions of others. One young man was preoccupied with philosophical topics, but made a point of not reading any philosophical books for fear this might deform his own thoughts. I'm laughing at this, but I've been in the situation where I've tried to argue with people online. They've basically taken offence on a philosophy channel that I was putting forward a philosophical argument. And I don't have a problem. Obviously, people disagree with me left, right, and centre. That's absolutely fine. But I do draw a line at people being motivated enough to go onto a philosophy channel. Not this one, by the way, it was a different one. But they go on a philosophy channel and then basically show contempt for the whole field of philosophy. It just strikes me as this notion being preoccupied with philosophical topics, but in a certain sense being anti-philosophy, because you want to make it up as you go along. You don't want to draw upon any other thinkers, because apparently you know it all. And the notion that such individuals are obsessed with abstract metaphysical or technical concerns, the whole net zero campaign, I think you could apply that to with relevance. So I am getting to the end now, believe it or not. I've been accused by a certain person of claiming I'm coming to the end and then going on for an extra half hour, but I can guarantee there's only 5 or 10 more minutes left. This idea of this is something I want to pursue because I've been looking. I've mentioned Kierkegaard in several videos. I've mentioned him in passing, and I don't think this is one of his better known works. I think it's an important work, but most people probably haven't heard of it. Concluding Unscientific Postscript, that classic page turner from 1846. But he has this concept of indirect communication, which it's another couple of videos worth all on its own. And he has this beautiful phrase, town criers of inwardness. And what I found interesting was I found this PhD by this Chan. Is it the University of Sussex, I think. So it's not long. It's the wonders. I criticise modern media, but to be able to get a whole PhD dissertation at your fingertips is brilliant. But he wrote, it's really, well, if you're a nerd like me, it's a really interesting dissertation all about the concept of indirect communication. But this town criers of inwardness is the notion that people who overtly shout about psychological states, and it's like the internet is full of people analysing or purporting to help people as self-help gurus or giving them psychological advice. And I just love this phrase, town criers of inwardness. Kierkegaard's whole counter-argument was inwardness is something that needs to be cultivated on an individual But surprise, surprise, without wishing to sound like Cilla Black, but surprise, surprise, inwardness is interiority is a personal thing. Shouting about it from the rooftops isn't the way to go. It needs considered reflection. So this indirect communication is a complicated idea he had, but it's basically a way of making ideas seem uncanny, rather than just saying logically A, B, and then C, or propagating an argument to somebody in logical terms or rhetorical, persuasive terms. Kierkegaard sometimes has this interesting way of approaching a topic obliquely and from the side, trying to get you to think, to make it appear uncanny what's going on. And that makes you have, I think, what's called a double reflection. You begin to reflect upon how you're reflecting. And so there's no direct thing being communicated to you, but also there's nothing. There's something uncanny is being communicated by Kierkegaard's way of doing this abstract philosophizing. And I think all the pictures I've shown you of De Chirico, I think he's doing something. It's an indirect communication. They're sunny pictures, but he's indirectly communicating a sense of melancholy. So indirect communication's purpose is to problematize the recipient's relation to that which he takes himself to already know. So why I picked up on this concept of indirect communication is so many people nowadays are ideologically convinced they're right about everything. And there is no discussion. There's an ideological certainty. And what Kierkegaard's brilliant at is making you question what you previously took for granted. So indirect communication dispels such illusion through provocation, that the indirect communicator provokes the recipient to engage in what Kierkegaard's pseudonym. Oh no! Every time. Pseudonymous author Johannes Climacus calls double reflection, which involves a process of self-examination. I've got a phobia now. I see words coming up at the end of a line, and normally I could say them no problem, but I begin to fixate. Here it's coming, and then I mess it up. Pseudonymous. I feel like Scott of the Antarctic. I will now leave the tent. I may be some time. So I'm now going to contrast what Kierkegaard, this idea of double reflection, this idea of indirect communication, making you question the extent to which that those things you think you already know may not be true, or to get you to think inwardly. And I would just contrast that with one of the absolute antithesis to this set of values, which is the old doom goblin herself, Greta Thunberg. I don't think's had a moment of self-doubt in her little goblin life. But to the extent to which art can represent or make you question in a way, in the sense of indirect communication, in direct opposition to this level of sanctimonious certainty, art achieves something else. So this is a famous still from the Eisenstein film Battleship Potemkin. So it's on the Odessa steppes. It's the Russian Revolution, and a nanny gets shot quite traumatically. And this is Fancis Bacon. Well, that's not him, but that's a painting. It was a study. It was a study of that nurse that you saw from the Battleship Potemkin. This is what influenced Bacon in this painting. and in opposition to. So these are artistic ways of making you think, making you ponder. And like Greta Thunberg, here's another example you might recognize. As opposed to the artistic, wonderful insight of Bacon, or you could think of Edvard Munch. This is the scream of the schizoid trait-addled, spoiled Western person who doesn't get what they want. It's completely non-verbal, primal, animal, lower mammalian sound of self-righteous indignation. Ah. I much prefer not the too dissimilar Francis Bacon version. Give me this anytime. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Until the next time, all the very best.